Hey there, Larry Stein, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service with you again today. And hey guys, it's March. Hard to believe we've turned another page on the calendar. So we're into March. So we're going to share with you some of our tips on our garden checklist today, but also invite you to share with us this month of March as we tackled some pretty interesting topics, some that you'll be sure to want to join in. Today, obviously, we have the garden checklist. We'll have Joe's backyard garden, so it'll be interesting to see how his garden is growing. We also have thinning fruit. You know, we've talked about pruning fruit trees. Obviously, we're looking for them to bloom this month now, and so once they set fruit, we'll be telling you how to thin that fruit, and that's a big challenge for a lot of us, pulling the fruit off once it sets. We're also going to be talking about landscape trees and shrub. Dr. George is going to do several things. Top 5 trees for 1-story houses. Also your top 5 trees for 2-story houses. But also the top 5 small ornamental trees. So you'll be sure to want to join in and hear Dr. George discuss those. I'll be telling you a little bit about fertilizing. You know, fertilizing often misunderstood, so we'll talk more about that later in the month. That'll be a key thing that we'll do this spring. And we're also going to introduce you to a new seedless grape, a seedless grape that grows in Texas. And kind of interestingly enough, the last original grape of that variety was grown right here on this particular farm. I had the last living plant in the world, and so all these grapes that are going to be propagated and sent out this year all came from this original source. So that's kind of neat. So without further ado, we'll highlight a few of the tips on our garden checklist today. One is, obviously, we need to have our bed prep in full speed. You know, if you don't have a tiller, obviously you may want to rent one. The job that a tiller can do to mix up the soil and incorporate fertilizer goes a long way. I would really encourage you to incorporate oak leaves as mulch. You see these oak leaves right here? They've broken down somewhat. Obviously, you don't want to incorporate them into the garden today, but once you plant, you can use them as mulch, and then when you incorporate them in, you're really going to greatly improve the tilth of your soil. So the tilth of this soil is really outstanding. So I'm going to be collecting oak leaves as they start to fall. You know, a lot of people put them on the curb. They have them in big black bags, and so there's nothing better than capturing oak leaves to mulch your plants, your landscape, whatever. And so I would really encourage you to be looking to do that. Now is prime time to buy smaller plants. You know, a lot of us like to do hanging baskets. A lot of us like to have a bowl of color that we set on our patio, whatever. And so now is prime time to buy smaller plants and pot them up into a larger container, hanging basket, whatever. And so then when spring comes, they'll be really ready to go, and you'll have a great display of color. You know, this year food prices in the grocery store are really going up, and so a lot of us are going to be gardening this year. We're going to plant vegetable plants. We're going to start seeding. March is prime time for a lot of people in Texas to begin planting. One of the things you'll want to check out on our garden checklist is the spring planting guide. And so you'll be sure you see the link there in the garden checklist. So you'll be sure to want to print out a copy of this so that you can plant about the right time. So notice there's 5 regions. The Region 1 is up there in the Panhandle, so they're going to plant later. Region 2 is West Texas. Region 3 is kind of central, which includes San Antonio. Region 4 is Corpus and a little bit south, and then Region 5 is the Lower Valley. So obviously the Lower Valley has plants already coming and growing, and the rest of us proceed up the state to plant certain crops. And so if you will look up this checklist, check it out, find your region, you'll see exactly when you need to be planting some of these crops. No guarantee. I mean, we're basing that on the average last frost-free date, but obviously it can get cold after that. But I would encourage you to check that out. Because Any vegetable plants you want to plant this year, you want them to be productive. Prices in the grocery store are higher, so we want to get the most out of what we plant. Tomato plants, you know, it's not uncommon for people to buy smaller plants right now. I would encourage you to do that. Get the smaller ones, pot them up into these larger containers. Pot them up into these larger containers, and then you'll be able to plant this later on. Grow it about 2 weeks in this pot, and then you're going to have a really full established root system. You put it into the ground, and it's really going to take off and do really well. So I would encourage you to do that with any of the tomato plants, pepper plants, eggplants, things like that, things that you're going to grow from transplants. Also prime time to be planting summer flowering bulbs, things like oxblood lilies, spider lilies, and things like that. So now is prime time. You plant the bulbs, and then you'll have a full display of color this summer. So now is prime time to do that. Can't underestimate fertilization. You know, we talk about fertilizing. Fertilizer is a big thing that makes plants grow. We tell you to use a 3-1-2 ratio, something like 19:5:9, and something like that. 3-1-2. That's the way plants use nutrients. If you're doing container plants, we like to use slow release, something like Osmocote, because typically you can't overdo it. And then the last thing we'll mention this afternoon, obviously we can't cover the entire checklist, but the last thing we'll mention is taking cuttings. You know, a lot of you have overgrown begonias and other plants that you carried through the winter, and so now would be a prime time to take these cuttings. You need about a 3 to 4 inch cutting, and you take your lower leaves off. Take your lower leaves off, cut the flowers out. You don't want these things to bloom. And then you will put them, you'll stick them in a well-drained soil of well-drained pot of potting soil. Well-drained pot of potting soil. And so what I would suggest to you is you put about 5 to 10 cuttings in this pot and let them root in. Let them root in. Some of you will want to use a rooting hormone. You can use a rooting hormone if you like, and that will help with your rooting situation. And so now is prime time to take some of these cuttings of these plants. Some plants may be hard to find this spring, and so if you want to root these things from cuttings, now would be prime time to do that. So, any questions today? So no questions today. So that's an introduction to our garden checklist. I hope you'll check it out. I hope you also will tune in for the rest of the month of March, because we got a lot of great programs coming up, things you don't want to miss. So until next time, this has been Larry Stein, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. Happy gardening.